this opportunity, as they say, takes me back.
20 years.
And maybe a little word of self-introduction and a little bit of explanation in which you will discover the errors in the Advocate General's approach. One should always speak respectfully, and thus far I do. I, as you can hear from my accent, come from Scotland, and I set up a practice with a friend in Brussels doing European law in about 1980. And at the same time, I did cases in Scotland, and I gave lectures and taught at the university. So I was, there were not many Scots who did European law. David Edward was one. I was much lower and much younger, but I was another. There weren't so many. And one day in Brussels, I received a request for an opinion from the Scottish Football Association. And the Scottish Football Association, which in those days had a reputation like the Welsh Football Association, but sadly it's more like the Mauritius Football Association today. The Scottish Football Association said, we have a practice in Scotland with respect to the transfer of young promising players. So the problem is this, the challenge I should say, which could be a problem. Football is a mutually interdependent activity. Professional team sports rely on uncertainty of outcome and approximate equality of opposition in any game. But at the same time, everyone knows that there's weak teams and very weak teams and very good teams. And the public likes it when good teams fight each other and weaker teams fight each other on a basis of equality. So the biggest teams have an interest in the continuing prosperity of the smallest teams. Now, and the biggest teams make money, the almost biggest teams break even, and everyone else loses money. That's the economics of professional sport. And of course, at grassroots level, no one makes money, it's done for pleasure, and that's fine. Now, one of the challenges for the organizer of the professional sport pyramid is to get money from the ones at the top who are wealthy and put money in the pockets of the ones at the bottom who need encouragement to go out and find young players, to cut the grass on Friday evening, to water the grass on Saturday morning, and to ensure that the game is played. So the first challenge, or the first practice which I was asked for, I'd never done sport law before, by the Scottish Football Association, was in Scotland, as elsewhere, we have a system when a young player aged under 21, maybe under 20, is transferred from, the Scottish equivalent was Brechin Rovers, a small club. I can't think of the French equivalent from Somme-et-Marne, but not quite a village club, maybe Chaumont United, is transferred to Glasgow Rangers or Paris Saint-Germain. So the local club has found this player when he was 12 years old, 10 years old, always male, and trained, went into the youth team, and gradually developed him and kept him, dealt with his problems as a juvenile, an outing with the national team, and then he's hired by Paris Saint-Germain or Glasgow Rangers or Arsenal. So the rule was the small club gets some money from Arsenal or from Paris Saint-Germain in order to reward the small club and incentivize the small club for the future. And if there were a dispute about how much should be paid, there's a table, how many goals, how many first team appearances, how many second team appearances, appearances for the national youth team, and so on. But, very absolute rule, never, 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 while this argument is going on about how much should be paid for the indemnité de formation, while that argument is going on, the player must be free to play. So, Bosman worked for Liège and was terribly treated. He was told, next season, you don't lose your job, but your pay will be 1/3 of what it was last year. So Liège wouldn't dismiss him because then they would be they would be obliged to pay him a dismissal indemnity. So they just said, your salary is going down, and go débrouillez-vous. So Bosman got a job with Dunkirk, and there was a UEFA practice similar to the national practice, whereby if the player was hired across a frontier from Scotland to France, say, the French authorities would take the player, register him to play, and the two clubs would discuss what, if anything, should be paid by way of indemnity. In the case of Bosman, that did not happen, and Bosman was the loser. Bosman should have been compensated. In addition to that, there was the practice, the rule, which had been blessed by the European Commissioner, several European commissioners, saying that it was open in the first division of the Football League for the first division for the league to establish a ceiling on the number of foreign players. And it would be, I think, 3+2 foreign players could play in the first division, each first division team, not more than that, as a way of encouraging the national team, because there was supposedly a correlation. I was never completely convinced, but everyone in football says I was wrong, so I was wrong. There's a correlation supposedly between the number of foreigners in the National League and the success of the national team. And if you look at the performance of England, you might conclude that that was right. There's lots of foreign players in the English First Division, and the English football team crashed out in the last 16. By contrast, in Wales, it's a poor, unwealthy national league, and there aren't so many foreign players, and the Welsh team is doing very well. I don't know what that proves, but
the Welsh the stars of the Welsh team, they play in big clubs abroad.
Yes. So the Scottish Football Association did not practice the second rule, but it did practice the first, and it was the practice in Scotland for years, for 50 years, that the judge in the Court of Session, the Scottish Supreme Court, who was the most enthusiastic about football, was the judge who had the job of deciding how much compensation should be paid if there was an argument between Brechin Rovers and Rangers. And there was a judge who had the job of saying, £552 is the appropriate compensation. So the Scottish Football Association said to me, what do you think? And as you heard from the Advocate General, the old European law from the 70s said purely sporting interest, European law does not apply, keep away from it. So very, very deferential to the practices of sport. And we said, well, it can be justified on these grounds and these grounds. And so we gave this opinion, And the Scottish Football Association said, thank you very much, and passed that on to UEFA. And UEFA said, we want... Yes. So that's how I got involved. Now, back to Mr. Bosman. He had clearly been wronged. He had been badly treated. However, his was, it was said, and I think not contradicted, his was the only example of such a problem occurring. No other footballer said, or was identified as having said, my transfer from my old club to the new club was blocked because of an argument over the indemnité de formation. So the argument of UEFA and the other clubs and the clubs, football association, was this works. It works regularly. There's no reason for it to stop. It's a wholesome, positive phenomenon. No need to worry. Don't change the system. Instead, make sure that Bosman gets his compensation. And then with respect to the second rule, you recollect I said that it affected first divisions. Now the rule, or the practice, of permitting 3+2 players from abroad affected only the first division. Bosman never played in the first division, so UEFA said, this is a hypothetical question. It's an interesting one, but you don't need to answer, and you shouldn't answer hypothetical questions. So the argument in Luxembourg was for a relatively young, in those days, advocate, quite a challenge, because the hauts magistrats of the 10, 12 member states were there on a kind of ceremonial visit. Everyone understands about football, so Bosman was picked as the case of the day. And as the argument was going on, one of the huissiers, one of the ushers, said, yes, TF1 wants to interview at lunchtime. Is that okay? And I said, yeah. So the impression was, and it was beautifully orchestrated by Luc Misson, who was the lawyer of Bosman. It was beautifully orchestrated that Bosman was hero, victim, and martyr. And Bosman came in surrounded by his legal team, funded by the Players' Union, I guess, and he looked very attractive. There were all these old guys in beards and wigs and silk and jabot and stuff, and there was poor Mr. Bosman, hero and martyr. We said, essentially, the fact that it didn't work on one occasion doesn't mean the whole system should be dismantled. The alternatives aren't as good, and catastrophe will follow if the world will not stop turning, but almost everything else in the world will go wrong unless Mr. Bosman's arguments are rejected in the sense that the system should be left intact. And in particular, we said that the rules on this is an association of associations of undertakings. So employment terms are routinely negotiated between employers and unions. So associations of associations negotiate with each other. So you can't touch, or you shouldn't touch it, on the basis of the rules on competition. It has to be on the basis, if at all, on the rules on free movement of persons. But the rules on free movement of persons have never been applied other than to state action circumstances, and this isn't state action. So we all want Mr. Bosman to be compensated, and we all on the football side want the thing to be maintained, the system to be maintained, because although he was wronged, it's exceptional for the future. So the judgment was obviously something of a disappointment, and there then ensued amazing passion. Heads of state, heads of government. It was the most mediatic drama. I was involved I was the lawyer of Microsoft, and I guess there were more journalists at the Microsoft hearing than there were at the Bosman hearing. But it was the same kind of earth-shattering excitement. And now, 20 years on, I think that what the football industry said has maybe, in part, been borne out by experience. In other words, the wealthiest have got more wealthy, and the poorest have got more poor. And poor Mr. Bosman is living in his mother's garage. He was on Social Security, and the report that I saw last year was that his Social Security from the Belgian state has been terminated because of his bad circumstances. So during the negotiations, I said to Luc Misson, Mr. Bosman can be rich or famous, but not both. And he chose to be famous. Luc Misson presented Jean-Marc Bosman as a victim and a martyr. And he succeeded in that presentation. And you commented that, well, the fact that he was the first one, like Madame Dufresne, to complain about the treatment kind of echoes that notion of Bosman as victim. Now, there's another way of looking at it, and that is what the football industry tried unsuccessfully to present it as, and that was a balanced way of addressing a problem. The rich clubs have too much money, the small clubs don't get compensated enough for their valuable work at the grassroots, and this is an effective way of doing it. And this is the only time in 10 years that the system has broken down. So let's compensate Bosman, but let's not damage the system. Now, the presentation by Luc Misson shifted the analysis to identifying it as the oppression of an individual, as opposed to a problem which could be argued in two directions. And there he was successful.